Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kent Cartwright. I'm the Deputy Director from MASB. I was doing a shout out there to Petoskey as prior to my gig here. I worked as the CFO at Petoskey for about 20 years. So, and I'm going to give the boring part of the presentation, and my cohort here, Jen Smith, who's much smarter than I am. I'll let her introduce herself. She's going to do the other half.
Hi, I'm Jen Smith. I'm Director of Government Relations. I've been here for about a decade, and before that was in the legislature for quite some time. So all that cynicism comes out in my presentations.
All right. Let's go ahead and get started here. So we're going to talk about school finance overview. Hang on to your seats because this is going to be a full throttle ride. And we're going to try and pack a whole lot of information here in a very short time. Obviously, you may come out of this with questions. Our contact information is at the end. Feel free to reach out to either Jen or I. We're here to help you out and answer those questions, no problem at all. So the first thing I want to touch base on is what is a budget? And it is more than just the dollars that are going in and coming out of your district. If you've heard the saying, follow the money, well, there's some truth to that. And what a budget tends to do is show what the Board of Education and the community believe are important. Because what people feel are important, that's where they tend to put their resources. Next slide, please. So, a budget is several things, for us or for you as board members. First thing, it is a living and breathing document. You're going to adopt a budget here in June for next school year, and that's going to be the first of several touches that you will have with that document. It is a living and breathing document, and why do we touch it? Well, why is it a living document? Well, your first go at it, you're going to have a lot of assumptions in it. And as those assumptions become knowns, that document is going to be updated so that you have, as you get better information, you update that budget. And again, as I suggested in the earlier slide, this document, this budget, is a translation of what you see as your priorities. As you'll see in a few slides, the vast majority of districts in Michigan prioritize the education of kids in the classroom, and it is reflected in your budget. But it is a translation of your priorities. And then finally, it's a political instrument. It is a mechanism for you as school board members and for your superintendents as representatives of your district to communicate to the public and to your constituents how the resources that have been entrusted to you are being used to meet social, economic, and in our case, educational needs of our students. So, a lot of things going on with the budget. In a good budget, it doesn't start with where did last year's budget end? So we created off of last year's budget. A good budget starts with what is our vision? What is our mission? What do we want to do? What is our focus? And if you can start there, if you start on what you believe are important and you build the budget to support that, that is a much more effective budget. If you as a board say third grade reading is a priority, and you say that up front, then your administrative team can go, okay, how do we achieve that? And that may mean, hey, in this budget board, I have included an additional reading instructor at third grade level or sixth grade level, or whatever it may be. If you don't have that vision in place ahead of time, then what you're going to get is a carbon copy of last year, and that may not be what your vision really is or where it is you want it to go. So start with the vision, get your goals in place, and from there the budget evolves. Next slide, please. So the budget calendar you can see here. You really, for the upcoming school year, which would be fiscal year 23-24, and that fiscal year starts for the vast majority of districts on July 1st. Your planning for that budget begins in January. So we've already started the process. And it starts with the Revenue Consensus Conference that the state holds. And if you're not familiar with what that is, and Jen can give you more details because I know she stays, pretty focused on it. But the state brings in experts from industry, from the universities, from departmental state departments, and they come to a consensus on what they think next year's funding is going to look like. So they're looking at tax revenues and where they think that's going to happen and the impact it will have on the state budgets. Your district business office is paying close attention to that because those are the first indicators of what's going to happen and how they should be thinking. Are we going to be in cut mode? Are we going to be in status quo? Are we going to be in, hey, we've got money to spend mode? That's our first indicator. And then what's happening right now, March through April, is your district business office they're busy little beavers, and they are working on that budget for next year. They're developing their budget assumptions. They're trying to guess what your September pupil count is going to be. They're trying to determine whether they need to adjust their staffing because of that pupil count. And they're having those conversations internally with building principals, with your central office administrators, and ultimately with you as board members. In May and June, the district is going to finalize the budget. This is where the board comes into play. You are going to have to hold a budget hearing, and you're going to have to adopt the budget. And as you can see there, you are required by law to adopt the budget by June 30. Now I'm going to pause there because sometimes, not often, but occasionally boards run into challenges where, hey, it's June 30, it's 10 o'clock at night, and we can't agree on what the budget should be. The nice thing about our state is that you can amend that budget as many times as you want. And on one or two occasions in my district, they would adopt the budget as presented with the agreement that they were going to meet in a week or 10 days in July to look at an amendment. That is perfectly acceptable if you run into an impasse like that. September and October, a lot of your assumptions become knowns. Things like pupil count. It is there in that first 4 to 6 weeks of time, we have we do our pupil count, and that is going to directly impact your revenue. Could be up, could be down. Again, your guess at what that was happened back in May and June. So one of the things I will, I suggest to board members is when you get your budget presented in June, make sure you understand what the assumptions are, but understand that also the people making those assumptions, they don't have crystal balls that are 100% accurate. So, be prepared to give them some grace, if they're off by some amount. They should be able to explain to you why there was some differences, but just understand there are going to be differences. November 1st, your audit report is required. That is the report from your independent external auditors on the prior fiscal year ended June 30. And then January and February budget revisions are going to go on in the current year budget. And so if you notice, this time frame is really busy for your business office because they are doing budget revisions on the current year budget, and they're developing their assumptions for the upcoming year budget. So if your CFO looks like his hair is on fire, or like mine, I no longer have any, that's because of having to do all these budgets at this time of year. And then here we are in June, and then at June, we do our final budget revision for the current year, right around the same time as we're adopting the upcoming year budget. So lots going on. Next slide, please. So where does the money come from? 77% of your funding comes from state sources, and the foundation allowance is the majority of that. Foundation allowance is generally the formula is number of students times the foundation allowance makes up the vast majority of your state funding. There are some grants out there that you also receive. At Risk, or 31A, is the most popular one, but there are a host of other grants that the state from the state level that make up that 77%. Next slide, please. So here's that foundation allowance, that formula that I talked about earlier. Now that allowance, the actual dollar part, the pupils you're going to figure out when you count them in September. The foundation allowance, that's determined by the state legislature and the governor during the budget process, which we are currently in the middle of, and Jen can talk to you at length about, because she basically lives it during this time of year. So we're always, paying attention. Is it going to be, is it going to be $100 more per pupil, or $500 more per pupil, or will it be a cut? Those are all the things we're worrying about at this time of the year. In addition, in order to receive your full foundation allowance, the state assumes that you, as a district, have passed the 18 mills on non-homestead property tax. If they assume it, if your 18 mills expires and you don't renew it, they're not going to send you any more money to make up that difference. I don't want to get too far into the weeds on this, because we do only have a short period of time with you, but understand that this is the 18 mills on non-homestead property. That tax is a key component of you making sure your district gets all of the revenue it is allowed to. And then obviously pupil count. Pupil count is a weighted average. I keep talking about September because that's the one that tends to be weighted more heavily, but they do use the prior year's spring count as there's some percentage of that that's used to get you a weighted average of pupils. I believe Jen is at 90-10 again this year.
I believe so. It hasn't changed in a while. October is weighted heavier than the previous February.
Yeah, it's been 70-30 for a while, 80-20, 90-10. I don't believe, certainly in my career, it was never below 70-30. So next slide. Federal money. Most districts do receive some federal money. Actually, almost everybody does, because you have a school lunch program. But most of us also enjoy federal funding that goes towards educating kids, specifically in the area of Title I. That is usually your largest or second largest federal program. And then IDEA, or the Individual with Disabilities Act, that funding is there to support students with disabilities and your special ed population. There are lots of other federal programs out there. English language learners is a big one. There are teacher development grants. We saw a lot of COVID money come in through various federal grants in the last few years. There are a lot of niche grants out there that can be available for various things, but Title I and IDEA are your two biggest. Next slide, please. So if we take a look at your district revenue here in this pie chart and the chunks that make it up, you can see here that your foundation allowance there in the blue makes up 67% of your money, with this foundation allowance that 18 mills in the orange there making up an additional 11. So those two together, foundation grant and the 18 mills, that makes up 78% of your overall funding. And you notice that if you look at the state grants that are added into it, those top three lines are all coming from the state of Michigan, and they make up almost 89% of your funding. So we pay a lot of attention to, we need to, and you need to, as board members, need to pay a lot of attention to what's going on at the state level. And that's what Jen does a very good job of, is to keep us on top of that and to make sure that we have a voice in, how that funding should be brought to us as school districts. Next slide, please. So how do we spend the money? We are a service industry. We are not a factory. And because we are a service industry providing education to kids, we spend on state average about 79% of our total available money on salaries and benefits. And that covers everything from, teachers in the classroom, their aides, their academic aides, your coaches, your administrators, your superintendent, your bus drivers, your custodians, there's a lot of people that are on your team that are necessary so that the district can provide education to our kids. 79% of our money is spent there. Purchase services, those are things that we hire somebody to do for us. A great example would be if you needed to hire a plumber to come in and do something, that would be a purchase service. Supplies are a minuscule 5%. I like to say this is where we buy our crayons and our edible paste for our kids. It's only 5% of the budget, but that actually is there's a Paul Harvey rest of the story here, because included in that 5% are your energy costs. So your natural gas or your natural gas costs are in there, your electricity costs are in there. So as you can begin to see here, you're not going to balance a budget challenge on the back of supplies or even on the back of purchase services. So you can certainly trim there, but you know, our money is up higher. Your capital outlay, these are the things that we are doing to maintain our facilities and our equipment, such as putting money into buses, putting money into the roofs and parking lots and things like that. Next slide, please. So again, I want to talk about personnel costs, just so you can get a feel for the questions that you can ask and the things that you want to understand as you're looking at your budgets. And understand that when somebody comes in and says, we're paying this teacher $40,000 as a salary, the actual impact in your budget is a lot larger because you're an employer. You have employment taxes that you have to pay that are they're a multiplier off of the salary. The retirement costs are an additional cost on top of that. And if you provide health insurance, with almost every one of us do, that has a cost. So you can see here that a brand new teacher right out of school, we're going to offer them a $40,000. They have a bachelor's degree and no experience. We're probably going to offer them a salary of about $40,000. But if they have a family and qualify for full family insurance, that teacher really costs our budget about $74,000. If we take a look at the state averages are about $62,000. If you look at that kind of equates to a master's degree with 4 to 5 years of experience is about where that falls in. And again, that $62,000 experienced teacher, they really cost your budget about $103,000. And then your really experienced teachers, the ones that have, figured it all out and been doing this for a long time, top end about $95,000 in salary and almost $150,000, in total cost. So I share this with you so that you know to ask the question. If somebody says, well, this teacher is going to cost me $40,000, the question you need to ask is that salary a total cost? And for budgeting purposes, you really need to know total cost so that you have an understanding of how it really is going to impact your budget. Next slide, please. So your capital expenses, what are these things? Again, they make up about 3% of your budget, but they can make all the difference in the world with how your community perceives your school district. So if you're trying to educate kids and there is water coming in the classroom and dropping on their desks, the perception of your district and the quality of education it provides is not going to be necessarily positive. And so best practice is you got to put some money aside to take care of your facilities. Make sure those roofs are tight. Make sure that just as the state has to worry about potholes in the road, you as school boards have to worry about potholes in your parking lot. Your HVAC system is it's always a challenge in institutional buildings to provide really comfortable and personalized environments for folks. You're not going to get that, but you can at least keep them reasonably warm or reasonably cool. But to do that, you've got to take care of your heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems. And to do that costs money. And best practice is to put some money aside for that. You're also going to have equipment costs that are going to come up. Examples here are a weight room. Does that directly impact instruction? No, but it does impact your athletic programs. And in most of our communities, athletics is an important part of the community, and is in many communities, it's an expectation of a service that the district provides. Band instruments also, if you got a band program or a fine arts program. And then last but not least, are your computer labs. You've got to keep your networks running, your computer labs up to date, your servers going, so on and so forth. So a good solid budget is going to have some money set aside for those items. The budget has there's so many other things there, and you can see there are a lot of moving parts in your budget. This is what your school business office does, your CFO does for you, is they figure all the stuff out and make sure that they got it plugged in there. But you can see that there are a lot of moving parts to keep track of. Next slide, please. All right. We cannot have a discussion on school budgets without talking about fund balance. So let's talk about what that is. So there are a couple of different ways to look at fund balance. The accountant's way is if you were to take the district's net income or net loss for every year since your district was born through today, and you added them all up, that would equal your fund balance. Well, that doesn't help you as a school board member. Another way to look at it is it's an informal scorecard. Every year that you have a win, meaning you have more revenue than losses, you add to fund balance. And in those years where you take a loss, that means your net income went down and you spent into your fund balance. Now that's a very conservative view, and I am not here to tell you that spending down your fund balance is necessarily bad. I would say that if you're spending it down with a plan, that's totally fine. But where districts get themselves in trouble is they end up spending down their fund balance, and it's a surprise. And even worse, it's a surprise because they have a built-in imbalance. That's where you run into challenges. And then the last thing on fund balance, the last way you could look at it is it's what's left in the checkbook after all your expenses are paid. And maybe that's the best way for you to think about it as a school board. If you think about it from your household budget viewpoint, if you're trying to decide, am I going to go on vacation to Disney, or am I going to go vacation to a campground up north? When you look at your checkbook, that checkbook balance that you have in there has an impact on how extravagant can it be on vacation. It's the same way with your district and its fund balance. Why do you need it? I mean, some folks are going to go, well, it's a school district and these are taxpayer dollars. Well, should we really be sitting on that? Well, one of the things that you have to worry about is the need for borrowing. And why you might have to borrow is for cash flow purposes. The money that comes into your district does not come in even amounts every month. And the way the money comes in doesn't match how you spend it and the timing of how you spend it. To give you an example, that 18 mills on non-homestead property, which makes up about 12% of your revenue, it comes in for many districts, it comes in January and February. Well, you've already started the school year, and 11% of your revenue, it doesn't even show up in the form of cash until you're many months into your school year. And so what happens, you get this imbalance between your revenue, your cash going out and your cash coming in. And if you don't have enough fund balance, then districts borrow from banks or from the school aid loan fund to help make sure they have the cash in those low cash points to meet payroll and pay the bills. Most districts, you're going to find that your low cash point is in right after Thanksgiving and just before Christmas, right in that December timeframe, because of how taxes come in and how state aid comes in. You need a fund balance in case you have a problem with a roof, or you have a problem where you need an extra bus, or you have something that you can't foresee occur. you've got the ability to say, okay, I need to fix this item, and where am I going to find the money? Well, it's in our fund balance. You're required by law to have a fund balance. There is an expectation that you as a board maintain it above 5%. If you get below 5%, then the state has some hoops it's going to ask you to run through. And worst part is if you adopt a budget that projects your fund balance to go below zero, then the state is going to actually provide you some oversight, whether you want it or not. So my recommendation is try to avoid that. It's not a fun position to be in. And then again, you can see the last couple of items here. It's really protection for the unexpected. Next slide, please.
So Kent, there's a question in the chat about, you mentioned the 5%, but is there a recommended total percentage that you have for fund balances?
Is that the next slide?
There you go.
There we go. So good question. Good. Corinne, I think it's Corinne. Sorry if I butchered your name. I apologize. Yes, there. So the good news is, yes, there are recommendations. The bad news is there is no one recommendation. So here are your options. I'm going to, in the interest of time, I will share with you what I did in Petoskey, and that was the middle one there based on annual cash flow point. What we decided, what the school board supported, administration recommended that we need to maintain enough fund balance so we don't have to borrow for cash flow purposes. And the reason being is that if we're borrowing, that means we're paying interest. And if we're paying interest, that's money that's not going towards the education of kids. And that was an effective argument when we went, and even we had negotiations, our teachers union understood that. And so I think in my district at the time, we had set a minimum of like $2.4 million. And it really was based on the cash flow point. So many districts do that. As a percentage, I think that was for us in Petoskey about 8%. For now, you may need to have more of a percentage depending again on how your cash flow works. Petoskey was unique. It collected 50% of its tax revenues in the summer and 50% in the winter, whereas many districts collect 100% in the winter. So district specific characteristics are going to impact how much that dollar amount is and what percentage it is if you decide to use the low cash point. But there are, here are a number of benchmarks for you to take a look at. Next slide, please. And Jen, I think this is you, and you got to unmute.
All right, well, I'm going to touch on one quick thing before I move into this. The question was about ESSER funding deadlines and spending deadlines. I did put a link in the chat to the Michigan School Business Officials. They have a wealth of information about finances, but they do have one particular page that talks about ESSER funding. There are 3 pots of ESSER funds, and each one has to be appropriated by September 30th of the year. So pot 1 had to be done by 2022, ESSER 2 was 2023, and ESSER 3 is September 30th of 2024. We have been in conversations with the feds to try to extend that because we know that with supply chain issues, with staffing issues, with all of these things, it's not possible for some districts to get all of that money appropriated. We've run into a lot of firewalls on that. Conversations have sparked back up with some of the new representatives. I don't know that we will see any relief. So at this point, your money, your last chunk of ESSER money has to be accounted for by September 30th of 2024. And that MSBO link that I put in the chat will have a lot more information than I can give you. So these are the funding sources you see for our school aid fund. So all of that money that Kent was talking about that flows out to you, it's got to come into the state somewhere. Biggest chunk of revenues for our state and for our schools are the sales and use tax. You see, it's 45% of our budget. We receive about 73% of all the sales tax that is collected. That is the major funding source. So you'll hear us talk about tax issues quite often, and as exciting as they are, it's because every time they cut something or exempt something from sales and use tax, that's another dollar that doesn't go into the school aid pot. The income tax is our next biggest one, and that we receive about 23% of the income tax collections. The most recent tax changes that went through that repealed the pension tax increases the amount we will receive as a percentage of the income tax to help cover that offset that we would have lost from the pension tax repeal. So that number is going to change a little bit, and that'll flush out as the pension tax repeal gets phased in. Big question everybody asks, and I've already seen it in the chat. What about the lottery? The lottery is only 7% of our entire budget. You could only run schools in our state on just the lottery money for about a week. But we do receive all of the lottery revenue. So everything after the costs and prizes are awarded, the state school aid fund receives the rest. Where people get confused and frustrated, and rightly so, is the lottery was supposed to be additional money into the school aid fund. But as we've seen the lottery come in, we have seen them move the general fund money, the other pot of money in the state, a lot of that support out. So while we're getting all the lottery money, it's not enough to make a difference to run our schools. But it does feel a little bit like a promise broken because they replaced it. They used the lottery money to replace the general fund money. So then you see some of the other taxes that are on there, the real estate transfer tax, the state education tax is that 6% tax that everyone has to pay. Online gaming is good. I bet that's going to grow. We just started that. We get a piece of it. And so I do expect that 2% for online gaming and sports betting to be bigger over the next couple of years as that industry grows. And then there's a lot of other places where small taxes here and there. The marijuana tax, if the sales tax that's on marijuana, yes, the schools get that. We also receive a little bit of the cigarette tax and the tobacco tax. Pieces of that come into our pie as well. They're just not huge pieces of the funding that we see. My slide didn't change. There we go. Go back. Oops. Those two are the same. All right, so the Per Pupil Foundation, this is just to give you an idea of where we've seen it go through the years. So this dates back to Proposal A when we started this formula. And originally there was a floor and a ceiling to the Per Pupil Foundation. In the last couple of years, we have closed that. So everyone's receiving the same thing except for a handful of districts that we'll talk about in a minute. But this sort of shows where, how many districts were in those places and just the changes through the years. And one of the things that this always shows, and there is another chart that will highlight it even more that Fiscal puts out, is this doesn't meet the rate of inflation. That really large dip in 12 was when federal money that had been coming into our per pupil ran out. We took that huge hit. So that wasn't totally a state cut. That was a loss of federal money as well. And the state didn't have the money to make it up. And so we took that huge hit in 12. We've slowly been coming back. And now we are at a foundation allowance just over $9,000 per pupil for just about every school in the state. So as I said, Proposal A had that gap in funding. The idea behind passing that is before that, our schools were based on property taxes, and it was incredibly inequitable across the state. And we even had a school up north that closed because they ran out of money. So Proposal A was passed by the voters. That's what established that 2 cents on the dollar that was additional for the sales tax. It jumped us from 4 to 6. Schools get all of that 2 cents. It established this foundation allowance, this target allowance. We're at that $91.50 right now. It took years. It was last year that we finally closed that gap. So I think there are a lot of districts that would have liked to see that happen faster, but the state just never really got there. They just kept moving the pieces along. There are 24 districts that we consider hold harmless. And these are districts that in to 94, when this was passed, they were leveraging a high amount of mills and receiving a lot of money for those mills in these districts. So the state allowed these 24 districts to go out one time and pass a millage to build on top of what the state was going to give them for the per pupil. If it passed in that time, they were put in this hold harmless gap. They've been 22J districts, they've been 22M districts, you may have heard those as well, but they would receive an increase from the state, but not necessarily at the same level as everyone else, because they were allowed to do operating mills, which you're not allowed to assess under Proposal A. The 46 districts that are out of formula, these are districts where the 18 mills that they collect fills their entire per pupil amount. So they're raising at least $9,150 per pupil in just the 18 mill collection. So they don't receive state funding because they don't have a gap to fill. Every other district, your 18 mills fill up the pot, and then the state puts the money on top to get you to the 9150. These districts raise it anyway. And so they're considered out of formula. But other than those 60, 70 districts, everyone else is at that $9,150 per pupil, no matter what. The ESSER funds, that is a technical question. It depends on how they flowed out, and each pot of ESSER funds had different rules. The ones that were tied to like the title, a lot of it was tied to title funding and Title 1A funding, which is your at-risk. There were districts that didn't receive as much of that because they didn't have the students. And so they weren't receiving ESSER money that other districts were. It didn't have anything to do with the hold harmless as we're talking about it. Theirs was more, those districts were a different set of districts, some overlap, but where their at-risk population was very small. And so they did not receive a lot of money from the feds, even though they faced a lot of the same costs. So it's confusing, but it's a slightly different set of districts. So categoricals, Kent touched on some of these. These are the biggest that we see. Your categoricals are things that are paid outside of your foundation allowance. Your foundation allowance is butts and seats. You have 37,000 students, you get 37,000 times 9,150. But then there's a special education categorical where you receive funding for that. There's an at-risk categorical, so you receive more funding depending on how many free and reduced lunch kids or economically challenged, disadvantaged kids you have in your district. You see other categoricals that are sort of grant-based. You want to do X program, you can apply to the state to pay for it. But these three on the screen are probably your biggest and the most common, the most known. Special education, they changed a bit last year so that now the state will cover 75% of the actual cost of educating that child on top of your per pupil. The governor's goal was to move to 100%. Her budget proposal this time is at 85, but we are hearing there are some representatives and senators that want to push that to 100 this year. Unfortunately, the federal government is at that 451 million under the IDEA. They are woefully unfunding states for special education. So as we see the state piece go up, the federal government is not growing like it should. So you are still spending operating dollars on your special ed kids because they're not being funded by the government in the way that it was promised. Special ed money is sent to the educating facility. So that's going to differ if you've got a center, if you're more of a center-based program, if you have kids within the district. So if you want to know where your special ed money is coming from, that's a business office question because it may be slightly different for each district. If pre-K passes, are there pros and cons to the state's educational funding? Of course. You see on their Great Start Readiness Program, right now we're funding it at $418 million, and that's covering about 28,000 kids. We're talking about thousands of more kids. And so it's going to put more kids in, or access for more kids in the system, and they will be funded at that 9150, which is where Great Start Readiness is at right now. So yes, there's going to be an effect to the funding system. There's a lot of questions about how all we're going to get there. This is not going to be fast, and there are questions about how it's going to affect actually the economy as well with private pre-K providers. So there's a lot of questions around universal pre-K, but it definitely will have a piece in the budget because we are already paying for Great Start Readiness. We pay for Head Start programs. This will just put more kids in that program. It'll be more money that will need to be spent on those kids. So how the budget process works, as Kent said, we're in the throes of it right now, although it is really quiet, which makes me really nervous. The Consensus Revenue Estimating Conference is held in January and May of every year. That conference brings in lots of economists to talk about light truck sales and home sales and inflation and lots of numbers and graphs. And it's a very pretty presentation, but it's very detailed. At the end, the Senate Fiscal Agency, the House Fiscal Agency, and the Department of Treasury sit down together and come up with their consensus. Based on all the information they have collected from the economists, what do they think the revenues in the state are going to be? And that sets the tone for how much money we're going to have to spend that year. Michigan constitutionally must balance their budget every year. They cannot deficit spend like the federal government can. So we have to know what these numbers are in order to move forward. This Consensus Revenue Estimating Conference said we have a lot of money, a lot of money. And so now how do we spend it? And a lot of it is one-time money that is like the Fed funds that are still sitting there waiting to be spent because we did not spend all of our American Rescue Plan dollars. Some of it is artificially inflated sales tax numbers. As we're still sort of coming out of the pandemic, we're still seeing the effects of that, where you had to buy things, not do things. And in Michigan, we tax things, we tax physical things, we don't tax services. So we've had all of this weird economic activity over the last 3 years, and that has really pumped up our coffers. But the economists have warned that's coming to an end. And so we also need to be careful that we don't go on massive spending sprees with all of the money and start all these new programs and new things that sound amazing, and then we don't have money for them in 2 years. So that's where the governor comes out with her budget. That generally comes out, it has to, by Constitution, be out by February 8th. That's generally the day it comes out. She proposes the budget for the state. There are two budgets, the general fund budget, which is everything, and the school aid budget, which is community colleges, public schools, and a portion of the universities. Anything that's not that is general fund. So there's two budgets that come out to spend the money that the state is receiving in their revenue. House and Senate subcommittees then start their hearings. So there's a subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee for every department in the state, including K-12. So they start holding hearings, talking to interest groups, to stakeholders, to people who want to spend the millions that we have. And then they come out with their versions, which go to their full appropriations committees. They then debate them. It goes to the floor in each, the House and the Senate. They can still debate it before they pass it. Generally, we see something by spring break. Spring break is 2 weeks away and we have nothing. So that's what makes me a little nervous because, as Kent said, you have to have your budget done by June 30th. The state doesn't have to have their budget done until September 30th. And that difference in fiscal years causes a lot of headaches for schools and municipal governments because our fiscal year is different. We were hopeful with all this money and one party in charge of all three, the House, the Senate, and the governorship, maybe we'd get an early budget. But the fact that we haven't seen anything yet is starting to cast doubts on my hope. But generally, we would see something by spring break. We come back from spring break and the chambers take each other's budgets and start going through them. We have the next Consensus Revenue Estimating Conference in May. Those are the final numbers we base the budget on, and then they can make final decisions and pass it. Ideally, we'd have it done by Memorial Day. Don't know that we're going to see that. They have been good about getting it done on June 30th, but that doesn't help you when it comes to budgeting. And we know that. Your reps and senators need to know that, especially if you've got a new one that doesn't understand the difference. So May will get those final numbers, and then they'll pass their final budgets. What really happens, this is the how does this really happen, it happens in conference committee, and a conference committee is made up of 3 people from the Senate, 3 people from the House, 2 from the majority party, 1 from the minority. It's really those 6 people in the governor's office that are hammering out the details of the budget. So all of these ideas that have been formulated and the budgets that the House and the Senate have put together, they come into a room with those 2 proposals and the governor's proposal and figure out what the final budget is going to look like. That really is how the sausage is made, and that's why people don't want to watch sausage get made. So they will come out with their agreement. Once that comes to the floor for a vote, it cannot be modified. It can't be amended. It's just a straight yes or no vote on the conference report. And then it goes off to the governor. In 2019, a law was signed that required the budget to be completed by July 1, but funny story, there's no penalty if it's not. So you have to, but it's up to them to hold themselves accountable. It's kind of a strange law. So then it goes to the governor for signature, and she has the power in a budget to line item veto things. So she specifically doesn't like money for a pet project. She can strike just that line. She can't do that in policy bills. It's all or nothing. And she can't veto parts of the budget that don't have money attached. So if it's just a section that talks about how money should be spent, she can't veto that. But if it's, here's $1 million to be spent on Algebra Nation, she can veto that one. And then once she returns that to the legislature, that's the budget, and it goes into effect at the fiscal year. Supplemental budgets can happen anytime. We've already seen 2 go through this year. They make adjustments for current fiscal year. And as we look at the money that's still on the table after those consensus revenue estimating conferences, for example, we have $4 billion on the table in school aid. They can do a supplemental budget to spend that in various places. And so those can happen at any time. Sometimes it's to spend the money. Sometimes it's because we need cost adjustments for things. We need to shift money between things because the budget wasn't exactly right. Similar to how you can make budget adjustments during the year, this is how the state makes budget adjustments. They have to pass a law with a supplemental budget in it. Threats. Diverting funding to higher education and community colleges. This is the #1 threat to the school aid fund. Back in 2010, Governor Granholm did a $150 million loan to community colleges out of the school aid fund. As any of you that have been paying attention to this more than a day or two, you know that that was not a loan. At this point, 13 years later, $500 million goes out to community colleges. We fully fund community colleges out of the school aid fund. Another about $500 million goes out to universities. The university budget is $1.5 billion. That's where our threat comes in, is when the general fund struggles. One of the fastest ways they can create room in the general fund is to move more higher education funding into the school aid fund. And we've watched them do that year after year. It's very frustrating. And now that they've been doing it for so long, it's hard to get it back out. It will take a constitutional amendment. Transferring programs from the general fund to school aid fund. The school aid fund does say it can only be spent for educational purposes. But if they can prove that what they're doing is an educational purpose, it can be paid for by the school aid fund. An example of that was school bus inspections and safety programs. Used to be paid for out of the state police budget. It is now fully paid for out of the school aid budget. And then changes in tax policy. As I mentioned in the beginning, any cut to income taxes, any cut to property taxes, any cut to sales taxes, all of those affect the whole pot of money that comes into the school aid fund. And we have been fighting those for years. And over the last few years, we've really seen some traction. And the biggest reward, I guess you could call it, was what I explained in the beginning about the pension tax, that we will not see a hit from the repeal of the pension tax because they will adjust what we receive from the income tax. And that is the best kind of protection we can get, is something that is formulaic. So it is not at the whim of the legislature. It's not some formula Treasury has to figure out. This is just what happens. And so the amount of money we receive will increase. So why are they funded to higher ed if they're also privately funded? The money only goes to our 15 public universities and the public community colleges. It does not go to our private universities. School aid dollars cannot go to private entities. It's against the Constitution. So higher education can charge tuition. They've got endowments. They have all the other ways that they are funded. But the state money that is there only goes to those public universities. So it's going to your U of M's, Western, Central. It's not going to Albion, Kalamazoo, Hillsdale. That's the difference, is the state funded universities, they're receiving the higher ed money or the school aid money. So other revenue factors, as Kent mentioned, we get federal grants. We get Title I money for our at-risk kids. We get the IDEA for our special ed kids, meal money for lunch and breakfast. And then there's other pots and other smaller things that go through there. Local sources, Proposal A said you cannot pass an operating millage. However, ISDs, especially ISDs, have passed career and tech millages, special education millages, or what they call enhancement millages. And those can all boost the pot of money available to the ISD, but they have to be used for the things specified. So you can't spend a CTE dollar on special education. You can't spend a special education dollar on your front office. They have to be spent where they've been raised for. And then finally, you can have millages at your local level, again, not for operating costs. Your millages at your local level are going to be your bonds for capital improvements, your sinking funds for things like security, technology, or capital improvements, or hopefully buses soon. That passed the Senate yesterday. But those millages also help boost the capital side of your budget, not the operating side of your budget. It's pretty clear you can't use those bonds and sinking funds for people, only things. And this is one of the things that causes such an inequity across our state as well when it comes to facilities, is there are places you can't get a bond passed, or your bond, 1 mil doesn't raise enough to make it worth it. We have been pushing very hard to get the state involved in school infrastructure. We did get money in the budget last year, but it has not yet been appropriated. So we're working on ways to help, especially those districts that can't pass a bond or don't have the tax base to make it worth it, to make sure that they have access to funds, that they can upgrade their capital as well, because the building you're learning in can be so very different and makes a difference for the kids. And right now, it's very hard for districts to be equitable when it comes to facilities. Questions for me or for Ken? There is a question in here. Explain the difference between a bond and a sinking fund. I will do this to the best of my ability and ask Kent to correct me when I screw it up. But a bond is a debt. And so you get all of the money. You could do this for building projects, big building projects, things like that. And you're going out for a certain amount. For a sinking fund, you receive the money, whatever is collected is what you have to spend. And so it is slightly different in how it's handled. With a bond, you've got a lot more interest that you have to pay. You don't pay that on a sinking fund. But the sinking fund is much more limited on what you can use it on. And Kent, what did I screw up?
Think of a bond as you get the pile of money all at one time, and a sinking fund, you get the money in bits over a period of time. Perfect. And how do ISD dollars work? Your ISD is receiving funding through 2 sections of the budget. there are various programs and grants that have to run through the ISD. So the amounts could be different each year depending on how they're coming in which line item they're coming from. The overall operational money that the state sends to ISDs does not generally come in very high. The governor has proposed a 5% increase in ISD funding this year,
But if it's the different amounts are probably your various categoricals, as we mentioned, those various grants and programs that are funded through the ISD, and those change year to year.
All right, I don't see any more questions. Oh, we got one more there.
So the $8 billion, I believe what you're referring to is the total amount of money that's on our balance sheet. 4 of that is school aid fund, approximately. That is money that they did not expend last year through the appropriations process. Some of that is federal money, some of that is state revenue. That's why we thought there would be more supplementals to spend that additional money. But at this point, it's going to roll into the next fiscal year to be available to be spent then. So the status of it right now is that we still have just about $8 billion on the books that has not been appropriated. And a lot of this goes back to the fights between the legislature and the governor on appropriating the federal money. Michigan is one of the slower states to get the federal money out the door. We still have American Rescue Plan dollars on the books. And so that's a lot of that $8 billion. So the goal, I think, will be to spend some of that down in the next budget. You may also see some of that go into rainy day funds, both the budget stabilization fund, possibly a rainy day fund in the school aid fund, and possibly a rainy day fund for the retirement fund. Education foundation money.
Yeah. So the foundation allowance is simply the term that's used for the majority of the operational educational funding that the state provides. In the overall budget, this foundation allowance is just one pot of money out of several that make up your total budget.
And it's referred to as the foundation allowance. It's referred to as your per pupil allowance, but it is that big chunk of money that the state sends to you, which currently is $9,150 per pupil.
So as we're winding down here, folks, this is the new board member series, which means you're learning a lot about your local districts, and the finance side it's like drinking from a fire hose. So just be patient. It takes, my experience is that it's going to take you a couple of budget cycles to really get your arms comfortable with it. Ask lots of questions. Jen and I are here. You've got our contact information. Your business office is there. Lots of, don't be afraid to reach out. That's what we're here for. Jen, you got that question, the $8 billion there?
Could it support wages for early childhood educators? It could. It has to be specifically appropriated for that. And we need to be careful when we look at some of this money right now. Yes, there's $8 billion on the book, but how much of it is that one-time money that came in because of the federal money that is the increased sales and use tax revenue? Because you don't want to take money that will expire or go away and put it into wages, because then your district is going to get stuck when the funding goes away from the state, but you're putting it into wages for a staff. So it's kind of confusing to explain it all, but we want to make sure that as we're going forward, the money we're putting into GSRP, that we're putting in to raise the pay for educators in early childhood, that is an ongoing funding source and something that we think the revenues in the school aid fund will continue to support. So yes, it could be used for that. However, the legislature has to appropriate it. And until they do that, you can't use it for anything. And if they decide to appropriate it for something else, and it's not specifically, if it's specifically appropriated for something else, it has to be used for that. That's where the categoricals come in, and there are always strings on categoricals.
Regarding the question about more of an ethics question, is the budget the responsibility solely of the superintendent, district business manager, administration? And basically, what role should a school board and a finance committee play? That is a conversation that the board needs to have with their superintendent. But the touchstone is the board sets the vision and the goals, and your budget should be developed to support that. Now, how much into the weeds you want to get with a finance committee is, again, it's really a conversation that needs to happen between those two. You've got some talented folks in your business office and with your superintendents, and ask them good questions and give them good direction. I think that the challenge becomes finding that balance between how deep in the weeds do you as a board member really want to get. What I would ask my board members for was, let's get the goals. What are we going to set as the goals for this year? And from there we can, then I can present you a budget and show you how the budget supports what you have determined is important. So hopefully that answers that question. All right, I think we are wrapped, right, Larissa?
Yeah, think so. Think we got all the questions.
All right, so if you want more drinking from the fire hose, we actually have a whole series of school finance. I sound like a salesman here, but we try to do in 1 hour what it takes us 3 hours to do in our basic school finance CBA. So thanks for being patient with us and asking good questions. Good luck in your role, and again, we're here for you. So thank you.